Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The old house breathes at night. I don't mean this metaphorically. I mean the walls physically expand and contract in the darkness. Wood creaking like arthritic joints, plaster exhaling dust that hangs suspended in moonlight. My grandmother's house has always done this, but now that I live here alone, the breathing sounds deliberate, conscious, watching. I inherited this place 3 months ago after my grandmother passed. At 21, with nowhere else to go after dropping out of college and my ongoing battle with depression, it seemed like the universe offering a solution. A quiet rural property, no rent to worry about, isolation to sort myself out. The perfect retreat from the catastrophe my life had become. But isolation breeds its own monsters. The first time I saw them was exactly 2 weeks after moving in. I'd fallen asleep on the couch downstairs. I avoided the upstairs bedrooms, especially my grandparents' old room, and woke abruptly at 2:57 a.m. My body felt leaden, pinned to the cushions by some invisible weight. The living room was bathed in blue television static, though I was certain I'd turned it off before drifting to sleep. And there, in the far corner, something moved. Not the casual shifting of shadows cast by trees outside the window, but something with purpose. A dense patch of darkness with greater depth than the surrounding dimness. It stood roughly 6 feet tall, vaguely human-shaped, but without distinct features. Just a hole in reality that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. My breath caught in my throat, lungs struggling against ribs that suddenly felt 2 sizes too small. The figure remained motionless for perhaps 10 seconds before sliding, not walking, behind the china cabinet. My muscles finally unlocked, and I scrambled for the light switch, heart hammering so violently I could feel my pulse in my eyeballs. The room, fully illuminated, was empty. I convinced myself it was sleep paralysis, a common enough occurrence for someone with my psychological profile. The medication I'd been prescribed often caused vivid dreams after all. I managed to calm myself through rational explanations, though I slept with every light in the house blazing that night. The next morning, I noticed 3 long scratches on the wooden floor, exactly where the shadow had stood. After that first night, the occurrences fell into a pattern. Always at 3 a.m., always preceded by an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow even the constant background hum of the refrigerator. Doors would slam upstairs though there was no wind. Footsteps creaked along the hallway outside my room. And the shadows, always the shadows, gathering in corners, slipping behind furniture, standing at the foot of my bed. I began leaving my laptop open and recording through the night. The footage showed nothing but occasionally jumped and distorted at precisely 3 a.m., the timestamp freezing for exactly 7 minutes before resuming normal recording. During those missing minutes, objects in my room would be slightly displaced. A book moved from desk to floor, my shoes arranged neatly when I'd left them scattered, the shower curtain closed when I'd left it open. My psychiatrist increased my medication when I mentioned these occurrences during our video session. He suggested my depression was manifesting as paranoid ideation, that isolation was amplifying my symptoms. He recommended I find a roommate or consider moving back to the city. But even through the chemical haze of increased medication, the 3 a.m. visitations continued, growing more intrusive. The shape at the end of my bed would lean closer, night by night. I began feeling cold fingers tracing patterns on my back when I tried to sleep. Once, I woke to find all the framed family photos turned to face the wall. I researched obsessively. Sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning. But the CO detector showed normal levels, and I began setting alarms to ensure I was fully awake at 3 a.m., yet still the phenomena continued. Then I found the YouTube video. It appeared in my recommended feed after weeks of searching for explanations of shadow people, a grainy amateur production titled Contacting Jinn, Shadow People, Dangerous Ritual Captured. Normally I would have scrolled past such obvious clickbait, but the thumbnail showed a shadowy figure identical to what I'd been seeing. The video featured a bearded man in his 30s, performing what he claimed was an ancient summoning ritual. He explained that jinn, entities from Middle Eastern and Islamic mythology, were beings of smokeless fire that could appear as shadows and attach themselves to locations and people. According to his rambling explanation, they were attracted to negative energy, particularly depression and isolation. My fingers trembled as I recognized my exact situation in his description. The ritual itself seemed absurdly simple. At midnight, place a black candle before a mirror, extinguish all other lights, and recite a string of words 3 times. The video creator warned viewers never to actually perform the ritual, claiming it had caused terrible consequences in his own life. I should have heeded the warning, but desperation makes fools of us all. That night, I gathered the materials. My hands shook as I positioned my bathroom mirror on the coffee table, placing a black candle I'd found in my grandmother's box of emergency supplies directly in front of it. At midnight, I extinguished all lights, my face ghoulish in the candlelight reflection. The words came out stuttered at first, then stronger with each repetition. Nothing happened during the recitation. No sudden wind, no temperature drop, no dramatic flickering of the candle flame. Just my own pathetic reflection staring back, hollow-eyed and gaunt from weeks of disturbed sleep. Disgusted with myself for falling for internet nonsense, I blew out the candle and went to bed, swallowing an extra sleeping pill for good measure. At exactly 3 a.m., I woke to find myself unable to move, paralyzed as though massive hands pressed me into the mattress. The darkness in the corner of my room was deeper than usual, more substantial. As I watched, frozen in terror, it formed into a humanoid silhouette that approached with fluid, inhuman movements. "We've been waiting for you to invite us properly," a voice whispered directly into my mind. It wasn't audible. Rather, the words formed in my consciousness as though they were my own thoughts, but with an alien resonance that sent ice through my veins. The pressure on my chest increased until breathing became a conscious labor. Sweat drenched my body despite the sudden, unnatural cold that filled the room. The shadow entity, the jinn, leaned closer, its featureless face now inches from mine. "This house remembers things you don't." With those words, memories that weren't mine flooded my mind. My grandmother as a young woman performing rituals in the basement, drawing symbols on the floor that matched those in the YouTube video. My grandfather building this house on land where terrible things had happened long before. Promises made, bargains struck, protection purchased through sacrifice. The shadow entity pulled back, and I gasped as the pressure lessened enough for me to draw a full breath. It moved toward my bedroom door, its form rippling like smoke underwater. Follow if you wish to understand. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I rose from the bed on trembling legs. My body felt simultaneously leaden and disconnected, as though I was piloting it from a distance. The hallway outside was impenetrably dark, yet the shadow was somehow still visible, gliding toward the attic stairs I had never dared to climb. Each step creaked beneath my weight as I followed, my breathing shallow and rapid. My heart pounded so violently I felt lightheaded, the rush of blood in my ears almost drowning out the whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. My mouth had gone desert dry, my tongue sticking to the roof as I tried futilely to swallow. The attic door hung open, though I knew I had sealed it shut with packing tape my first week in the house. From inside came a faint bluish glow that reminded me of the television static from my first encounter. The shadow entity waited just beyond the threshold, somehow taller now, its form stretching until it nearly touched the sloped ceiling. Behind it, I could make out shapes, other shadows moving independently of any light source, gathering around something on the floor. Your grandparents understood the old ways. They maintained the balance. In the center of the attic floor was a perfect circle drawn in what looked like ash, containing intricate symbols I couldn't comprehend but somehow recognized from the memories that had been forced into my mind. The patterns throbbed with meaning, sending waves of nausea through me as my perception tried to accommodate concepts it wasn't designed to process. The entity gestured toward the circle, and the memory knowledge surfaced again. This house stood on a thin place, a boundary where the veil between worlds stretched translucent. My grandparents hadn't built their home here by accident. They had been caretakers, maintaining ancient wards against something that pressed constantly against that membrane, hunting for weaknesses. When they died, the protections began to fail. The shadow entities, the jinn, weren't attacking me. They were warning me. The ritual I had performed, based on the YouTube video's corrupted information, hadn't summoned them. It had weakened the last barriers holding back something far worse. As this understanding crystallized, the floorboards beneath the circle began to bulge upward, wood splintering as though something pushed from below. The shadow entities moved restlessly, their forms becoming more agitated as the bulge grew more pronounced. The bargain must be renewed. The price must be paid. My legs nearly buckled as comprehension dawned. The price wasn't death. It was service. Guardianship. My grandparents had committed their bloodline to maintaining the boundary, and in my ignorance, I had almost unleashed whatever lurked on the other side. The main shadow entity approached, extending what might have been a hand. It didn't speak again, but I understood the choice being presented. Take up my inherited responsibility, or leave the barrier to fail entirely. My depression suddenly seemed trivial compared to the cosmic obligation before me. In that moment, I realized my grandmother's insistence that I visit often, her strange lessons about the house's personality, her deathbed whispers I had dismissed as delirium, all had been attempts to prepare me. With shaking hand, I reached toward the entity. The moment we connected, searing pain shot up my arm as knowledge flooded my consciousness. Rituals, symbols, timings, warnings accumulated over generations. I understood now why my family had always seemed strange to outsiders, why we kept to ourselves, why this remote property had remained in our possession despite financial hardships. The bulge in the floor receded as the circle began to glow with renewed power. The shadow entities dispersed like smoke in wind, their purpose fulfilled. I stood alone in the attic, trembling with exhaustion and revelation. Dawn broke as I made my way downstairs, my mind reeling with new understanding and purpose. The house felt different now, not threatening, but expectant. I was no longer an intruder, but a caretaker. My phone buzzed with a notification. The YouTube video I had watched was gone, deleted by its creator. In its place was a private message. I see you've taken up the mantle. Welcome to the Guardians. You're not alone. The house breathed around me, but now I understood its language. I would learn to breathe with it. After all, some shadows protect us from darker things that wait beyond the light. Story 2. The old have wisdom that the young dismiss as superstition. I know better now. Some things lurk in the spaces between dreams and reality, hungry things with patient smiles that wait for disbelief to create openings. My daughter's nightmares taught me this. Her tormentor came in azure hues and mocking laughter, and in the end, only faith, not reason, could drive it away. The first night it happened, I was jolted awake by Eliza's screams. Not the brief cry from a typical nightmare, but sustained primal terror that sent me running down the hallway, heart hammering against my ribs. I found her sitting upright, eyes wide open but seeing something beyond the darkened walls of her bedroom. Her skin was slick with sweat, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. When I touched her shoulder, she flinched violently. She was here, Eliza whispered, her voice hoarse. The blue woman. I assured her it was just a dream, nothing more. I checked her closet, beneath her bed, behind the curtains, the routine of a father dispelling a child's nighttime fears, though my daughter was 22. When her breathing steadied, I left a glass of water on her nightstand and returned to my own disrupted sleep. The dream came again the next night, and the next. Eliza described an elderly woman with skin the color of a bruise, with spider-thin fingers and a mouth that stretched too wide when she laughed. According to Eliza, this apparition would lean close and whisper, "Cover your head, little piggy," before reaching for her with those elongated fingers The consistency of the details unsettled me. By the fifth night, dark crescents had formed beneath Eliza's eyes. She moved through our house like a ghost herself, starting at shadows, wincing at sudden sounds. I suggested a doctor, perhaps a sleep specialist. Eliza merely shook her head, saying they wouldn't understand. Her refusal frustrated me. I was an engineer, a man who believed in solutions, in the measurable and explicable. Yet my daughter's suffering had no schematic I could follow. That night, I decided to stay in her room, settling into the reading chair in the corner. Eliza fell into an uneasy sleep while I watched over her, a biography open but unread in my lap. The hours stretched. My eyelids grew heavy. I dozed. A sudden drop in temperature woke me. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. My breath fogged in front of my face, which made no sense. It was July in Arizona. I reached for the light switch, but my arm felt leaden, unresponsive. A pressure had settled on my chest, as though something heavy sat there. I could move only my eyes, which darted frantically around the darkened room. The moonlight filtering through the blinds cast striped shadows across Eliza's sleeping form. As I watched, helpless in my paralysis, the shadows between the stripes of light seemed to deepen, to coalesce. A figure formed at the foot of her bed, hunched and thin. Though I couldn't see its face clearly, I knew it was smiling. It didn't move like a person. Its movements were jerky, staccato, like film-missing frames. One moment at the foot of the bed, the next leaning over Eliza, its face inches from hers. Its skin reflected the moonlight with a bluish tinge. I strained against my invisible bonds, my jaw clenched so tight I feared my teeth would crack. A high, thin humming filled the room, modulating into what sounded like laughter. The figure's head swiveled toward me, though its body remained bent over my daughter. I glimpsed a slash of white, its smile, and roomy eyes that reflected no light. The pressure on my chest intensified. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. The thing's mouth opened, wider than any human mouth should, and I heard a rasping whisper, "Cover your head, little piggy." I woke with a gasp, nearly falling from the chair. The room was normal. No cold, no pressure, no figure. The clock read at 5:42 a.m. Eliza slept peacefully, for the first time in nearly a week. I rubbed my face, trying to make sense of what had happened. Sleep paralysis, I told myself. A waking nightmare triggered by stress and Eliza's suggestible stories. But when Eliza woke, she seemed different. The shadows beneath her eyes had darkened. Her movements were sluggish, her speech slightly slurred. She said she hadn't dreamed at all, but didn't seem rested. She claimed not to remember what the blue woman had said to her in previous dreams. This struck me as odd. She had been explicit about it before. That afternoon, I found Eliza staring blankly at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her hand tracing patterns on the glass that her reflection did not follow. When I called her name, she startled, then brushed past me without explanation. Later, I caught her whispering to herself in the kitchen, her lips forming words that looked like cover and piggy, and soon. Fear wrapped its cold fingers around my spine. I began to research night terrors, sleep disorders, even rare neurological conditions. I found nothing that matched Eliza's symptoms or the progression of her behavior. Desperate, I called my father, Eliza's grandfather, a retired pastor with whom I'd had little contact since my wife's death years before. Our relationship had been strained by my rejection of faith, my insistence on empirical evidence over biblical claims. But desperation breeds flexibility. My father listened without interruption as I described Eliza's nightmares, my own experience, and her deteriorating condition. His silence stretched so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, he spoke, asking if I remembered my Aunt Marion, my mother's sister who had died when I was young. I didn't. He described how she had suffered similar nightmares before her death, dreams of a blue woman who whispered threats. I felt the blood drain from my face as he continued, explaining that these visitations had been documented in our family for generations, always targeting those who had experienced profound grief. Eliza had never recovered from her mother's death. She carried that pain like a second shadow. My father's voice grew firm as he told me what needed to be done. A blessing, a ritual from the old country that predated even Christianity, though it had been wrapped in its trappings by our ancestors. He would come tomorrow. Until then, I was to place salt across Eliza's doorway and windowsills, and under no circumstances was I to fall asleep in her presence again. I wanted to dismiss his superstitions, to cling to my rational foundations, but the memory of that blue-tinged face hovering over my paralyzed form stripped away my certainty. I did as he instructed. That night proved the longest of my life. I sat in the hallway outside Eliza's room, back against the wall, fighting sleep. Every time my chin dropped to my chest, I would jerk awake, heart racing. Around 3 a.m. I heard Eliza talking, her voice alternating between her own and something higher, almost sing-song. I pressed my ear to the door but couldn't make out the words. When I tried the handle, it wouldn't turn. I called her name, softly at first, then with increasing urgency. No response. I put my shoulder to the door, once, twice, before it gave way. Eliza sat cross-legged in the center of her bed, head tilted at an unnatural angle, smiling at the corner of the ceiling. The salt line across the doorway was broken, scattered. I followed her gaze to the corner where shadows seemed to pulse and shift. "Eliza," I said, my voice barely audible. She turned to me slowly, her smile too wide, her eyes unfocused. "She says you're a little piggy too, Daddy," she said, but the voice wasn't entirely Eliza's. "Little piggies need to cover their heads before the butcher comes." I crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbing Eliza by the shoulders. Her skin felt cold, clammy. I shook her, gently at first, then harder when she continued to smile that horrible stretched smile. "Eliza, snap out of it." Her head lolled back, then forward. For a moment her eyes cleared, filled with recognition and fear. "Dad?" she whispered, her own voice again. "She's here. She's always here now." I held her close as she began to tremble, whispering reassurances I didn't believe. Over her shoulder, I saw the shadows in the corner deepen, taking on that familiar hunched shape. My throat constricted. My limbs grew heavy. The temperature in the room plummeted. I fought the paralysis with everything I had, focusing on Eliza's weight in my arms, the solidity of her presence. The shadow figure flickered, advancing with that jerky time-lapse movement. I dragged Eliza toward the door, my movements sluggish as though wading through molasses. The high, thin humming began again. We made it to the hallway. I slammed the door, knowing it wouldn't hold, knowing doors meant nothing to whatever this was. I half-carried Eliza downstairs to the kitchen, as far from her bedroom as we could get. She was more lucid now, but weak, barely able to stand. I sat her at the table and frantically called my father, the digital clock on the microwave showing 3:47 a.m. He answered on the first ring, as though he'd been waiting. I didn't waste time with explanations. "It's happening now," I said, my voice shaking. "What do I do?" My father's voice came clear and strong over the line. He told me to put him on speaker, then to find salt, rosemary from the spice rack, and any iron tool. I did as instructed, placing the phone on the table between Eliza and myself. As I searched for the items, the lights in the kitchen flickered. The humming grew louder. Eliza's eyes kept drifting to the doorway, widening with terror at something I couldn't yet see. I found rosemary, a cast-iron skillet, and the salt I'd used earlier. My father began to recite something, not in English, not in any language I recognized. The words sounded ancient, guttural. As he spoke, the air in the kitchen grew thick, charged like the moments before a lightning strike. The hair on my arms stood on end. The shadow appeared in the doorway, more solid than before. In the harsh overhead light of the kitchen, I could see it clearly for the first time. The blue woman. Her skin wasn't just tinged blue, but the deep azure of a corpse left too long in water. Her eyes were milky, her lips blackened. That too wide smile revealed teeth filed to points. She wore the tattered remains of what might have been a nightgown decades ago. "Cover your head, little piggy," she rasped, her voice like nails on slate. "The butcher is hungry tonight." My father's voice grew louder through the phone. I fumbled with the salt, pouring a circle around Eliza and myself, nearly dropping the container when the blue woman took a stuttering step forward. The lights flickered more violently. The temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the windows. My breath clouded before me. Eliza began to keen, a high, frightened sound. The blue woman's form flickered, like a television with poor reception. She advanced another step, then another. I raised the iron skillet, knowing it was useless, but unable to stand by without some attempt at defense. My father's chanting reached a crescendo. The blue woman stretched out those spider-thin fingers toward us, toward Eliza, and then, between one heartbeat and the next, something changed. The air pressure shifted. The blue woman's form wavered, becoming less substantial. She opened her mouth in what appeared to be a scream, but no sound emerged. My father's voice cut off abruptly, replaced by his calm instruction to sprinkle the rosemary over Eliza's head and then my own. I did so with shaking hands. The blue woman's form grew increasingly transparent, her movements more frantic. She lunged forward, passing through the salt line as though it weren't there. I swung the skillet reflexively, passing it through her insubstantial form. A cold so intense it burned washed over me. For a moment, I felt her presence inside me, ancient, malevolent, hungry. Then it passed, leaving me gasping. The blue woman stood at the edge of our table, her form barely visible now. She was no longer smiling. Her expression held something I never expected to see. Fear. "Finish it," my father said through the phone. "Say the words I taught you as a boy." I hadn't thought of those words in 30 years. The prayer my father had insisted I memorize, the one I'd rejected along with the rest of his faith. But they came to me now, rising from some deep recess of memory. Words of protection, of banishment. I spoke them, my voice growing stronger with each syllable. The blue woman writhed as though in pain. Her mouth opened in that silent scream again. Her form grew fainter still, until she was just an outline, a suggestion in the air. With a final violent twist, she vanished. The light steadied. The temperature began to rise. Eliza slumped in her chair, unconscious but breathing steadily. My father was still on the line. He explained what I already knew, what I'd denied for decades. Our family had been haunted for generations by this entity, this blue woman who fed on grief and fear. She targeted those most vulnerable, inserting herself into their dreams, then gradually into their waking world. The ritual he'd performed, the one my ancestors had passed down, was the only protection. I looked at Eliza's peaceful face, the first time I'd seen her truly at rest in weeks. I thought of my Aunt Marion, who had died without the protection of this ritual. I thought of my own stubborn denial of anything beyond the measurable, the rational, and how close that denial had come to costing me my daughter. My father arrived the next morning, bringing with him ancient books and family records documenting encounters with the blue woman going back centuries. Together, we performed a more permanent version of the ritual, blessing every room in the house, every doorway and window. Eliza grew stronger by the hour, the shadows beneath her eyes gradually fading. She remembered little of her possession, for which I was grateful, but she remembered the dreams, the whispered threats. "Cover your head, little piggy." A warning, my father explained, not a threat. The entity had been giving away its own weakness, compelled by rules older than itself. Covering the head, a ritual protection that the entity itself couldn't help but reveal. I've made peace with my father, and with the understanding that some things exist beyond the reach of science. Some nights I still wake at 3:17 a.m., my breath fogging in warm air, a pressure on my chest. But I know the words now. I've learned to believe. And when I speak them, the pressure lifts, the cold recedes, and I'm left in the comfortable darkness of an ordinary night, safe from the things that smile from the corners of our perception, waiting for disbelief to create openings. The old have wisdom that the young dismiss as superstition. I am no longer young. and I am no longer foolish enough to disbelieve. Story 3. The forest doesn't breathe at night. That's what I first noticed when I moved to the cabin. The unnatural stillness that descends after sunset, as if the entire woodland holds its breath, waiting. The daytime chorus of birds and rustling leaves gives way to a silence so complete it feels like pressure against your eardrums. You strain to hear something, anything, to break the void. And when that something finally comes, a snap of a twig, or the soft shuffle of movement just beyond your field of vision, you almost wish for the silence to return. I came to these woods to escape. The doctors called it acute social withdrawal syndrome, but I called it self-preservation. After 32 years of forcing smiles and meaningless conversations, something inside me simply broke. The cabin belonged to my uncle, abandoned for years after he disappeared during a hunting trip. The family avoided discussing both him and the property, so when I mentioned wanting it, they practically signed over the deed that day, relieved to wash their hands of the place. The first 2 weeks passed in blessed isolation. I established a simple routine, gathering firewood in the morning, foraging for mushrooms and berries in the afternoon, and reading by lamplight until sleep came. No phones, no internet, no human contact. The persistent tightness in my chest began to loosen, like a fist slowly unclenching. I felt myself becoming part of the forest's rhythm, until the night they appeared. I was returning from the creek with freshly filled water jugs when I spotted movement in the clearing ahead. 3 figures stood at the edge of the tree line, motionless, watching. The evening light caught them at an odd angle, casting elongated shadows that seemed disconnected from their forms. I froze, water sloshing in the containers, heartbeats suddenly loud in my ears. They weren't rangers. Their clothing looked handmade, oddly antiquated. Not hikers either, as they carried no gear. One raised a hand in greeting. The gesture was stiff, mechanical, as if they were unfamiliar with the motion. My throat constricted, but I managed to nod in acknowledgement. They approached with synchronized steps, moving together like a single organism. As they drew closer, I noticed something unsettling about their faces, a vague blurriness, as if I couldn't quite focus on their features no matter how hard I tried. The tallest one spoke. Their voice sounded wrong, like air rushing through hollow wood, words flowing together without proper pauses for breath. They asked if I lived alone in the cabin. The question sent a cold trickle down my spine, but isolation had made me desperate enough for interaction that I didn't immediately retreat. I confirmed that I did, adding that I preferred the solitude. The trio exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them that made my skin prickle with unease. They introduced themselves as fellow hermits who had been living deeper in the forest for a very long time. No names were offered, and I didn't provide mine. They suggested building a meeting place between our territories, neutral ground where we could occasionally gather. The proposal struck me as bizarre, yet I found myself nodding in agreement. There was something compelling about them, a gravitational pull I couldn't resist, despite the warning bells clanging in my head. For the next 3 days, we worked on constructing a simple shelter in a small clearing halfway between my cabin and where they claimed to reside. They brought materials I didn't recognize, strange twisted branches and fibrous plants I'd never seen despite my daily exploration of the surrounding forest. Their building technique was peculiar. They never used tools, only their hands, which moved with unsettling precision. They worked primarily in silence, communicating through subtle gestures and expressions that were impossible to interpret. When they did speak, they asked questions about modern life with an odd detachment, as if discussing a foreign culture. They seemed particularly fascinated by technology, though they claimed to have no interest in returning to civilization. I found myself revealing more than I intended, details about my breakdown, my family, my reasons for retreating to the woods. They absorbed every word with intense focus, heads tilted at identical angles, never blinking quite often enough. At dusk on the 3rd day, the shelter was complete. A domed structure large enough for 4 people to sit comfortably, woven so tightly it seemed impervious to wind or rain. We stood back to admire our work as the last light faded from the sky. One of them suggested meeting again the following evening to make it properly ours. Before I could ask what they meant, they melted into the darkening forest with uncanny speed, leaving me alone with an inexplicable heaviness in the pit of my stomach. I slept poorly that night, plagued by dreams of roots growing through my body while I lay paralyzed. I woke repeatedly, convinced I could hear breathing outside my window, only to find nothing but that oppressive silence when I gathered the courage to look. Morning brought a thick fog that clung to the ground like smoke. I delayed my visit to the shelter until mid-afternoon, when the mist finally burned away. What I found stopped me dead in my tracks, the blood in my veins turning to ice water. The shelter, so meticulously constructed just hours before, was decaying before my eyes. The once sturdy branches had blackened and warped, dripping with a viscous fluid that resembled tar. Mushrooms sprouted from every surface, not the familiar varieties I'd been foraging, but grotesque, bulbous growths with pulsing red veins. The entire structure seemed to be breathing, expanding and contracting almost imperceptibly. The air around it buzzed with flies, their bodies unnaturally large and iridescent. My rational mind grasped for explanations, some type of rapid mold perhaps, or a chemical reaction between different plant materials, but nothing could account for the scale of decomposition that should have taken months compressed into a single night. As I circled the shelter, my foot sank into the ground with a sickening squelch. The earth around the structure had turned to black mud, though there had been no rain. The smell hit me then, a putrid stench of rot so powerful it triggered my gag reflex. I stumbled backward, sleeve pressed against my nose, yet couldn't tear my eyes away from the abomination before me. That's when I noticed what appeared to be handprints pressed into the decaying walls from the inside, as if someone, or something, had been trying to claw their way out. Panic surged through me like an electrical current. I turned and ran, crashing through underbrush, oblivious to the branches whipping against my face. My lungs burned and my legs trembled, but I didn't slow until I reached my cabin, slamming the door and throwing the bolt with shaking hands. As daylight waned, rational thought slowly returned. I convinced myself that my friends had played an elaborate prank, somehow accelerating the decomposition process with chemicals. I resolved to confront them the next day, anger temporarily overriding my fear. But as darkness fell, the forest's silence took on a different quality, expectant, like an audience waiting for a performance to begin. My skin tingled with the certainty of being watched. Every creak of the cabin's old timbers sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. I sat rigid in my chair, eyes fixed on the door, a kitchen knife clutched in my sweating palm. Around midnight, the scratching started. Gentle at first, like tree branches against the walls, then growing more deliberate. Slow, methodical scrapes moving around the cabin's perimeter. My breath came in shallow gasps, heart hammering so violently I feared it might burst from my chest. The temperature plummeted, my exhaled breath suddenly visible in the lamplight. The scratching stopped directly outside my window. I sat paralyzed, eyes wide, as a shadow gradually darkened the glass. Too tall, too thin to be human. A hand pressed against the pane, the fingers elongated and jointed in impossible places. Though I couldn't make out the figure's face, I felt its gaze boring into me with physical force, rooting me to the spot. A voice drifted through the walls, that same hollow, breathless quality I'd heard before, but now distorted, as if multiple voices spoke in imperfect unison. "We've been alone so long. Let us in. We want to wear you." The lamp flickered, shadows dancing across the walls. When the light stabilized, the window was empty. But the scratching resumed, now at the door, accompanied by soft, insistent whispers, too faint to decipher. The doorknob slowly began to turn, though I knew with certainty that I had bolted it. I broke from my paralysis then, scrambling to brace a chair under the handle. The whispering intensified, seeping through the cracks in the walls, filling the cabin with fragments of phrases that made no sense yet filled me with unspeakable dread. Empty for so long, need substance. wear you from inside. Hours passed in a blur of terror, my sanity fraying as the assault continued. Sometimes the voices seemed to come from inside the cabin itself, hissing directly into my ears though I was alone. The temperature continued to drop until frost formed on the inside of the windows. My muscles cramped from constant tension, teeth chattering uncontrollably. Just before dawn, everything stopped. The silence returned so abruptly it felt like a physical blow. I remained frozen in place, afraid to trust the reprieve. As the first pale light filtered through the windows, exhaustion overcame fear, and I collapsed into a fitful sleep. I woke to bright midday sun and the distant call of birds. Normal forest sounds that seemed impossible after the night's events. For a moment, I wondered if I had dreamed the entire experience, a product of isolation and an overactive imagination. But the frost on the windows had left water stains as it melted, and deep scratches marred the door's exterior when I finally worked up the courage to remove the barricade. Driven by a compulsion I couldn't explain, I returned to the site of the shelter. Nothing remained. Not the rotting dome, not the blackened earth, not a single unusual mushroom. The clearing looked undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been built there. I might have believed I was losing my mind if not for one detail. At the center of the clearing lay 3 small, identical objects. Picking one up, I recognized it as a crude doll, fashioned from twigs and mud, with a lock of hair, my hair, bound around its middle. I spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every sound, sleeping only in short, restless bursts. I considered leaving but feared what might follow me back to civilization. Instead, I began researching the area's history, digging through my uncle's old papers stored in the cabin's small attic. What I discovered chilled me more deeply than the entities themselves. Newspaper clippings from the 1930s detailed the disappearance of 3 local individuals over a single winter. Each had reported encountering strange figures in the woods before vanishing. The articles mentioned a search party finding an unusually deteriorated structure deep in the forest, but no trace of the missing people. More disturbing were my uncle's journal entries from just before his disappearance. He described meeting 3 solitary individuals who kept to themselves in the forest, their features indistinct, their movements unnaturally synchronized. They had proposed building a meeting place. His final entry mentioned returning to the structure after finding it mysteriously decayed overnight. The pattern stretched back further. Similar disappearances roughly every 30 years, always preceded by reports of 3 strange figures. I realized with growing horror that I was caught in a cycle that had claimed countless others before me. They returned last night. I heard them moving around the cabin, calling out in voices that now mimicked my uncle's, my mother's, even my own. They promised answers, companionship, an end to loneliness. Their offers were tempting, so tempting that I found myself reaching for the door handle before catching myself. I understand now what they are. Not ghosts in the traditional sense, but something older, emptier, hollow things that need to be filled. They've worn many faces through the centuries, discarding each when it no longer serves. They're patient, and they're persistent. They don't need to break down my door because their true assault is on my mind, my will. I'm leaving tomorrow, heading back to the world of noise and people and meaningless conversation, a world that suddenly seems far less threatening than the silence of these woods. I don't know if distance will be enough to break their influence. Perhaps they can only exist here, bound to this place by rules I don't understand. Or perhaps they'll follow, wearing the faces of those 3 strange figures that now populate my nightmares. What I know with devastating certainty is that they're still out there, waiting, and that the feeling of being watched will never completely leave me. The forest doesn't breathe at night, because something else is using all its air, something ancient and empty, endlessly patient, wearing faces that don't belong to it, building shelters that were never meant to protect. Story 4. The copper smell of blood filled my nostrils as I completed the final line on the wooden floor of my apartment. 3 years since Afghanistan, and the nightmares still hadn't stopped. 3 years of therapists telling me it would get better, that the memories would fade. They lied. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, I was taking matters into my own hands. The dim glow of my apartment's single lamp cast long shadows across the living room walls. Outside, rain lashed against the windows, the staccato rhythm matching my heartbeat. I'd heard about the ritual from Torres, another vet who swore it had helped him find peace. Something about confronting the darkness, he'd muttered during our last VA group session, making a deal with whatever's waiting on the other side. I hadn't believed him then. Now desperate for any solution, I was willing to try. The Charlie game was supposedly meant for teenagers with pencils and paper, asking stupid questions to a Mexican ghost. But Torres had modified it. Blood instead of pencils. A proper summoning circle instead of crossed writing implements. He'd been vague about what exactly came through, but he'd stopped attending our sessions shortly after. The counselor said he was doing better, had moved away to start fresh. I needed that fresh start too. I sat back on my heels and examined my work. The circle wasn't perfect, but it would do. My palm stung where I'd sliced it open with my combat knife, the same one I'd carried through 2 tours. The blood had flowed easily, more than I'd expected, enough to complete the intricate pattern Torres had drawn for me on a cocktail napkin. 4 quadrants within the circle, each with its own set of symbols that I didn't understand. At the center, 2 lines of blood intersected to form a crude cross. Charlie, are you there?" My voice sounded hollow in the empty apartment. Nothing happened. The rain continued to beat against the windows, and somewhere in the building a door slammed. I cleared my throat and repeated the words, this time louder. Charlie, are you there?" The air seemed to thicken around me. The hair on my arms stood on end as the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. I told myself it was just the storm outside affecting the building's heating system. Nothing supernatural, nothing to fear. But then the blood moved. I blinked hard, certain I was hallucinating. The intersecting lines at the center of the circle shifted, as if drawn by an invisible finger, the cross rotating slightly clockwise. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, transfixed. This wasn't part of Torres's instructions. He'd said I might feel something, a presence perhaps, but he hadn't mentioned this. "What are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The blood at the center of the circle bubbled slightly, then settled. No further movement. No response. Just the sudden, overwhelming sense that I was no longer alone in my apartment. I scrambled to my feet, nearly slipping in my haste. Torres hadn't told me how to end the ritual, how to close whatever door I might have opened. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, planning to call him, to demand answers, but the screen remained black. Dead, though I'd charged it just hours earlier. That first night, nothing else happened. I cleaned up the blood as best I could, though it left faint stains on the wooden floorboards that refused to come out no matter how hard I scrubbed. I convinced myself it had been a momentary delusion, a product of stress and too many sleepless nights. The rotating blood, a trick of the light, the sudden cold, a weather-related power fluctuation, the dead phone, a coincidence. I almost believed it, until I woke the next morning to find a set of wet footprints tracking across my bedroom floor. They led from the foot of my bed to the closed bedroom door. 4-toed prints, too large to be human, too distinctly formed to be a spill or shadow. They glistened in the morning light filtering through my blinds, as if freshly made, though they were dry to the touch when I finally gathered the courage to examine them. They disappeared at the threshold of my bedroom door, as if whatever had made them had simply vanished. My heart hammered against my ribs as I searched every inch of my apartment. Closets, cabinets, under the bed, behind the shower curtain, all empty. The front door remained locked from the inside, the chain still in place. The windows were sealed shut, had been since I moved in. Nothing could have entered. Nothing should have been able to leave those footprints. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Perhaps I'd sleepwalked, knocked over something that had spilled. Perhaps the pattern only resembled footprints, my mind connecting random shapes into something recognizable. I spent an hour cleaning the floor, erasing all evidence of the prints. then left for my shift at the security firm where I'd been working since my discharge. The day passed without incident. I didn't mention the ritual or the footprints to anyone. Who would believe me? They'd think I was having another episode, like the one that had cost me my previous job. So I kept my mouth shut, did my rounds, and tried to convince myself that returning to my apartment that evening would reveal nothing out of the ordinary. I was wrong. The scratches started that night. 3 parallel lines gouged into the wooden frame of my bedroom door, deep enough that splinters protruded from the edges. They hadn't been there when I'd left that morning, I was certain of it. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling the rough texture, the unmistakable evidence that something with claws had been in my home. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I tell them? That I'd performed some blood ritual and now a ghost or demon was scratching up my apartment? They'd have me committed. Instead, I did the next best thing. I set up my phone to record the living room while I slept. If something was moving around my apartment at night, I'd catch it on video. The footage the next morning showed nothing, just my empty living room, undisturbed for the entire night. But the new scratches on the inside of my bathroom door told a different story. Same pattern, 3 parallel lines, as if something had tried to claw its way through. And worse, when I stepped out of the shower, I found matching scratches on my back, reflected in the steamed-up mirror. 3 lines, red and inflamed, running from my right shoulder blade to the middle of my back. My hands shook as I applied antiseptic to the wounds. They weren't deep, barely breaking the skin, but their presence was undeniable. Something had touched me while I slept. Something had marked me. The thought made my stomach lurch, and I barely made it to the toilet before emptying the contents of my stomach. I called in sick to work, then spent the day researching. Everything I could find about the Charlie game, about summoning rituals, about how to reverse them. Most of what I found was teenage nonsense, stories of slumber party scares and urban legends. Nothing about blood variations or what to do when something actually answered your call. By evening, my apartment felt like a prison. Every creak of the building, every shadow in the corners seemed malevolent. I couldn't stay there another night, so I threw some clothes into a duffel bag and checked into a motel on the edge of town. The place was run down, the kind that rented by the hour, but it wasn't my apartment. It didn't have wooden floors stained with ritual blood. It didn't have scratched doors or mysterious footprints. It felt safe, or at least safer. I was wrong about that too. The motel room's bathroom mirror revealed my reflection, and something else, a shadowy figure standing just behind my left shoulder. My heart nearly stopped as I whirled around, finding nothing but empty air. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. Sleep was impossible. I sat with my back against the headboard, lights on, knife in hand, until dawn broke. Every slight noise had me tensing, ready to defend myself against an attacker I couldn't see. The rational part of my brain insisted I was having a breakdown, that PTSD and isolation had finally pushed me over the edge into paranoia and hallucination. The rest of me, the part that had survived firefights and ambushes by trusting my instincts, knew better. Something was hunting me. I returned to my apartment the next day, drawn back by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The scratches had multiplied, appearing on every wooden surface, door frames, floorboards, the legs of my coffee table. And now there was a smell, subtle but unmistakable beneath the scent of the wood and my own fear sweat. The copper tang of blood, like the ritual had never ended, like it was still ongoing somewhere just out of sight. My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly dropped it. Torres. I hadn't been able to reach him for days, had left increasingly desperate messages. His voice sounded distant, hollow, as if he was speaking from the bottom of a well. According to Torres, what I'd done wasn't a game at all. The ritual he'd shown me wasn't meant to call Charlie or any human spirit. It was older, designed to open a door for something that existed in the spaces between reality, something that had been waiting for an invitation. And I had invited it, sealed the pact with my own blood. When I asked how to send it back, the line went silent for so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Torres spoke again, his voice now barely above a whisper. He explained there was a way, another ritual, more complex than the first. It wouldn't banish the entity completely. Once summoned, such things never truly leave. But it would bind it, restrict its ability to interact with our world. I performed the binding ritual that night, following Torres' instructions precisely. More blood, more symbols, arranged in a pattern that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. This time, when I spoke the words he'd taught me, the response was immediate. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that my breath fogged in the air. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, coalesced, moved against the walls in patterns that defied physics. And then I saw it, or at least part of it, a limb extending from the darkest corner of the room. Not quite an arm, not quite a tentacle, tipped with 4 elongated digits that ended in curved talons. It reached toward me, and I felt a pressure on my chest, as if enormous weight was pressing down, forcing the air from my lungs. Blackness crept in at the edges of my vision as I struggled to breathe, to move, to complete the ritual. With the last of my strength, I spoke the final words Torres had given me. The pressure vanished instantly. The shadow limb withdrew, the temperature returned to normal. For a moment I thought it was over, that the entity had been banished. Then I felt it, a presence inside my mind, a consciousness brushing against my own. Not gone, bound, to me. That was 3 weeks ago. The scratches have stopped. The footprints no longer appear in the night. To an outside observer, my apartment would seem normal, untouched by supernatural forces. But I know better. I feel it waiting, watching through my eyes, experiencing the world through my senses. During the day, I can almost forget it's there. Almost. But at night, when I close my eyes, I see what it wants me to see. Vast landscapes of twisted architecture, worlds where physics operate by different rules, where light behaves like liquid and darkness has weight and substance. And sometimes, in those dreams, I catch glimpses of others like me, humans who performed rituals they didn't understand, who now serve as vessels, as windows between worlds. Torres was right about one thing. The nightmares about Afghanistan have stopped. They've been replaced by something far worse. The knowledge that I'm never alone, will never be alone again. That I've become a door that cannot be closed. I've started to notice changes in myself. Small things at first. Food tastes different, colors seem brighter, or sometimes shift in my peripheral vision. My reflection doesn't always move in perfect synchronization with me, as if there's a slight delay, or as if something else is adjusting to the mechanics of my body. The binding holds for now. The entity cannot fully manifest in this world, cannot act independently of me, but I feel it learning, adapting, finding the edges of its confinement, testing, waiting. If you're reading this, if you've heard about some ritual that promises peace or power or answers, walk away. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, some games aren't meant to be played, and some things, once invited, never truly leave. I know that now. I live with that truth every waking moment, and in the dreams that no longer feel like my own. I wasn't just summoning something from another world. I was offering it a home, in me. Story 5. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the turbulence. It was the cold, a piercing, unnatural cold that seemed to emanate not from outside the aircraft, but from somewhere inside. Perhaps from inside me. The temperature dropped so suddenly that my breath fogged in front of my face, despite the cabin's environmental controls. Nobody else seemed to notice. The businessman beside me continued typing on his laptop. The flight attendant 3 rows ahead still poured coffee with a practiced smile. But I knew something had shifted in the fabric of reality around me, even before I saw her standing in the aisle. I never knew my Aunt Thilia in life. She died in 1970, 15 years before I was born, in what the family only ever referred to as the incident. There were no photographs of her displayed in any family home. Her name was seldom mentioned at gatherings, becoming one of those familial ghosts that haunts not through presence, but through conspicuous absence. All I knew came from snippets of overheard conversations. She had been a flight attendant. They called them stewardesses back then, for Pan American. And she had been buried barefoot because of some superstition my grandmother held about shoes and the afterlife. Yet I recognized her immediately when she appeared at the front of the cabin during the worst turbulence I'd ever experienced. The Boeing 737 had been cruising smoothly at 30,000 feet somewhere over Nevada when the first jolt hit. My stomach lurched as the plane dropped what felt like 100 feet in seconds. The fasten seatbelt signs pinged on, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, assuring us that we were merely experiencing some unexpected rough air, and that there was nothing to be concerned about. I'd flown enough to know that pilots always downplayed turbulence, but the tremor in his voice suggested something different this time. The second drop was worse. The overhead bins popped open, spilling bags and coats into the aisle. A chorus of gasps and muffled screams filled the cabin. The plane shuddered like a living thing in pain. My knuckles turned white against the armrests as sweat beaded on my forehead despite the unnatural cold. That's when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. In the momentary darkness, something changed. When the emergency lights stuttered on with their sickly yellow glow, the aisle that had been empty moments before was now occupied. She stood facing away from me, her dark blue uniform crisp and perfect, her hair pulled back in an immaculate bun according to regulations that hadn't been enforced for decades. Even from behind, something about her posture was wrong. Too rigid, too still amidst the violently shaking aircraft. No one else seemed to notice her. The businessmen kept typing, the flight attendants remained strapped in their jump seats, and the panicking passengers focused on their oxygen masks dropping from the ceiling. I blinked hard, convinced she was a hallucination born of fear and altitude. When I opened my eyes, she had turned to face me. Her features were familiar in that strange way family resemblances work. I recognized my own eyes staring back at me, though hers were glazed and vacant. Her lips, blue with cold, moved as though speaking, but no sound reached me over the roar of the struggling engines and the screams of fellow passengers. The most disturbing detail, however, was her bare feet against the airplane carpet. They were pale, almost blue, and somehow looked both solid and insubstantial at once. They left wet impressions on the floor. Not water, but something darker that disappeared seconds after she lifted each foot. My heart hammered against my ribs as adrenaline flooded my system. My mouth went dry, and I found myself unable to swallow. Logic screamed that this couldn't be happening, that the woman standing impossibly still in an airplane being thrashed by atmospheric forces couldn't be my long-dead aunt. Yet some deeper, more primal part of my brain recognized the truth immediately. Whatever was looking at me through those familiar eyes wasn't entirely human anymore. She began moving toward me. Each step was wrong, too fluid and too jerky simultaneously, as though her movements were being edited together from different frames of film. My breath came in short, painful gasps. The cold intensified until it felt like my lungs were filling with ice crystals. I wanted to scream, to alert the other passengers, but my voice had abandoned me. The businessman beside me continued typing, oblivious. When she reached our row, he didn't look up, didn't react at all as she leaned over him to stare directly into my face. This close, I could see that her skin had the waxy quality of a department store mannequin, and fine cracks spread from the corners of her eyes and mouth like a porcelain doll left too long in the sun. She mouthed words I couldn't hear, but somehow the meaning penetrated my consciousness anyway. Not your time. Not yet. The plane lurched again, more violently than before, and I was thrown against the window. Pain exploded in my temple. For a moment, blackness engulfed me, not unconsciousness, but something deeper and more absolute, as though I'd been plunged into a void where light had never existed. When awareness returned, we were still in the air, but the turbulence had subsided to a gentle rocking. The cabin lights were back to normal, and the captain was announcing that we had navigated around the worst of the storm. Relief flooded the cabin. People laughed nervously, gathering their scattered belongings, dabbing at spilled drinks. Everything appeared normal, except for the lingering cold that clung to me like a second skin, and the wet footprints leading from the front of the cabin to my row, slowly evaporating in the recycled air. I spent the remainder of the flight in a state of rigid terror, eyes darting to every movement, ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. The rational part of my mind insisted I'd experienced a stress-induced hallucination, perhaps even a minor concussion from hitting my head against the window. The wet footprints could be explained by spilled drinks during the turbulence. The cold was just the aircraft's temperature control system compensating after the electrical fluctuation. But I knew better. When we landed in San Francisco 3 hours later, I was the last to deplane, scanning every corner of the cabin for any sign of her. The flight attendants exchanged concerned glances as I lingered, clearly noticing my pallor and the tremor in my hands. One of them asked if I was feeling all right, suggesting that sometimes turbulence could trigger anxiety attacks in even experienced travelers. I mumbled something affirmative and hurried into the terminal, desperate for the solid ground beneath my feet and the reassuring press of crowds. That should have been the end of it. A strange experience at high altitude, an anecdote to share after a few drinks, a story that would either be received with nervous laughter or concerned looks. But as I collected my luggage and headed for the exit, a familiar cold spot bloomed between my shoulder blades. I froze, suitcase half lifted from the carousel, as goosebumps erupted across my skin. Slowly, I turned around. The baggage claim area was packed with arriving passengers, but through gaps in the crowd, I caught glimpses of her. Standing perfectly still amid the flowing human traffic, that dark blue uniform, those bare feet. Each time someone walked between us, she seemed to be closer, though I never actually saw her move. My heart raced so hard I feared cardiac arrest. Sweat soaked through my shirt despite the chill that now permeated my entire body. I abandoned my suitcase and ran, shoving past tourists and business people, ignoring their protests. I didn't stop until I burst through the terminal doors into the humid San Francisco night. A taxi took me to my hotel, where I locked the door, closed the curtains, and sat with every light blazing until dawn. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I needed sleep, that everything would make sense in the morning. Around 5 a.m., exhaustion finally overcame fear, and I drifted into an uneasy slumber. The dream came immediately. I was back on the plane, but it was empty except for me and Aunt Tilia, who sat across the aisle. In the dream, she could speak, though her voice sounded like wind whistling through cracks in a sealed room. She told me about the crash that had taken her life, details my family had never shared, how the plane had encountered turbulence much like what we'd experienced, how the pilot had made a fatal error, how she knew they were going to crash minutes before it happened, how she'd removed her shoes because she'd heard that shoes were often the only things that survived plane crashes intact, and in some irrational part of her mind, she thought that if her shoes survived while she died, her soul might somehow be trapped in them. I wanted to wake up, to escape the increasingly distorted version of my aunt sitting across from me, her features subtly shifting and melting like wax under heat. But I remained trapped in the dream as she explained her purpose. She had been watching over our family for decades, she claimed, intervening when death approached prematurely. The turbulence on my flight hadn't been random. It had been a mechanical failure that should have resulted in catastrophic decompression. She had prevented it, but such intervention came with a price. A life extended must eventually be collected, she told me, her face now barely recognizable as human. Not your time yet, but soon. I'll come for you when it's time. I woke with a strangled scream, drenched in sweat yet shivering with cold. The hotel room appeared normal in the morning light filtering through the curtains. No sign of supernatural visitation. No barefoot prints on the carpet. I took a long, hot shower, trying to wash away both the physical and psychological residue of my experience. By checkout time, I had almost convinced myself that stress and exhaustion had created the entire episode. 2 weeks passed. I returned home to Chicago, resumed my work routine, and the memory of Aunt Thilia began to fade like an old photograph left in sunlight. Sometimes at night, I would wake with an inexplicable chill, but I attributed it to Chicago's notorious drafty apartment buildings. Then came the call that changed everything. My mother, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't identify, asked if I would come to Thanksgiving dinner this year. Before I could answer, She added something that made my blood crystallize in my veins. She had been going through my grandmother's effects and had found Thilia's old uniform, perfectly preserved in a garment bag since 1970. She thought I might like to have it, given my interest in family history. There was something strange, though. The uniform was complete except for the shoes. My grandmother had apparently been adamant that Thilia be buried barefoot, insisting it was an old country tradition. My mother kept talking, unaware of my growing horror, mentioning offhand that it was odd I'd brought up Aunt Thilia at all. According to her, I'd called 3 weeks ago, the night of my flight, and left a rambling message asking questions about my aunt's plane crash. I had made no such call. As my mother continued speaking, I became aware of a familiar sensation spreading across my apartment. That unnatural cold that had first manifested on the airplane. My gaze was drawn to the hallway outside my bedroom, where the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been in the mid-afternoon light. I didn't need to look to know what I would see if I did. I could already feel her presence, patient, inexorable, waiting. Not my time yet, she had said, but soon. I realized then what I should have understood from the beginning. Aunt Thilia hadn't saved me from death on that turbulent flight. She had merely delayed it, marked me, connected us in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. And somewhere in my apartment, wet footprints were appearing on the floor, one after another, coming steadily closer. Story 6. The whispers began the moment we brought them into our home. Not audible whispers, nothing so obvious or merciful, but rather a persistent sensation of being observed, of a presence that demanded acknowledgement. The 3 pre-Incan vessels, each no larger than a coffee mug but infinitely more significant, sat innocuously on the custom-built glass shelf in our living room. Their earthen surfaces, adorned with faded geometric patterns in rust and black, betrayed nothing of their true nature. But I knew better now. I knew they were waiting, watching, hungering. I never wanted to bring them to Canada. 6 months ago, my career as an investment banker had reached its pinnacle with a substantial promotion that necessitated our relocation from New York to Toronto. My wife, Elena, an art history professor specializing in pre-Columbian artifacts, had been thrilled, not about moving to Toronto specifically, but because the journey would take us through Peru for 2 weeks. A necessary detour, she called it, to acquire items for her research. I should have questioned her enthusiasm more thoroughly. Elena had always been passionate about her work, but there was something different about her fixation on these particular artifacts. She'd discovered them through an academic contact in Lima, 3 ceremonial vessels from a previously undocumented burial site near Cusco. The authentication paperwork seemed legitimate enough, though I later learned how easily such documents could be fabricated. The transaction occurred in a dimly lit back room of an antiquities shop that smelled of incense and damp earth, with a proprietor who seemed too eager to part with the vessels despite their apparent historical value. When I questioned the surprisingly reasonable price, Elena dismissed my concerns. She explained that the vessels were from a minor regional culture, of interest primarily to specialized academics like herself, rather than major museums. I accepted this explanation, despite the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach as the shopkeeper wrapped each vessel in cloth that looked suspiciously like funeral shrouds. Our guide, a local man named Miguel, had grown increasingly agitated as we finalized the purchase. While Elena was occupied with payment details, he pulled me aside and spoke in rushed, accented English. He advised against taking the vessels, saying they came from a ceremonial site and were known locally as vasos de sangre, blood cups. When I pressed for more information, he became evasive, mumbling something about the vessels requiring periodic feeding and being best left in their native soil. I dismissed his warnings as superstitious nonsense designed to extract additional money from tourists, a common enough scam. That night in our hotel, I noticed Elena handling the vessels with unusual reverence, running her fingers along the rim of each one in a motion that seemed almost ritualistic. When I mentioned Miguel's warning, she laughed it off, though the sound lacked genuine amusement. She assured me that indigenous artifacts often accumulated such legends over time, particularly those associated with sacrificial practices. It was simply part of their cultural history, nothing to concern ourselves with. The flight to Toronto was uneventful, though I noticed a peculiar dampness on the cloth surrounding one of the vessels when we unpacked. Elena suggested it was condensation from the pressurized cabin, and I accepted this explanation despite knowing the cargo hold wasn't humid enough for such an effect. Our new home, a spacious Victorian in Rosedale, welcomed the vessels with an almost palpable shift in atmosphere. Elena arranged them prominently in our living room, angled so they caught the morning light through the bay windows. She spent hours photographing them for her upcoming paper, often losing track of time until I found her at 3 a.m., still adjusting lighting and angles with bloodshot eyes. The first incident occurred 3 weeks after our arrival. I woke to find a thin trail of rust-colored water leading from our bedroom to the living room. Following it, I discovered one of the vessels had somehow been moved from its shelf to the floor. The red substance inside, which I initially took for dirty water, had partially spilled onto the hardwood. Elena appeared unusually calm about the situation, theorizing that vibrations from a passing truck had dislodged it. She cleaned up the mess herself, refusing my help and disposing of the rags immediately. I didn't mention that the substance had smelled metallic, like copper, like blood. My position at the Toronto office demanded considerable attention, so I initially failed to notice the subtle changes in our household. The power fluctuations that occurred precisely at sunset, the persistent cold spot near the display shelf that defied our top-of-the-line heating system, the dreams that began to infiltrate my sleep, dreams of arid mountains, of dark chambers carved into bedrock, of figures in elaborate headdresses chanting around 3 empty depressions in a stone altar. Elena changed too. She spent increasingly long periods staring at the vessels, often motionless for hours. Her academic work, once her primary passion, fell to secondary importance. When her department chair called concerned about her extended absence, I realized she hadn't attended faculty meetings for weeks. She began wearing exclusively red clothing, first subtly, in accessories, then more overtly in sweaters and dresses. When I commented on this fashion choice, she seemed genuinely surprised, as though unaware of the transformation. The household accidents began approximately 2 months after our arrival. First, I sliced my palm while chopping vegetables, a deep cut that bled profusely onto the cutting board. Elena, rather than rushing for the first aid kit, calmly collected the blood-soaked board and disappeared momentarily before returning with bandages. I later found the board thoroughly cleaned, but not in its usual place in the kitchen. Next came Elena's nosebleed, sudden and violent, occurring precisely as she stood before the vessel display. Rather than stepping away to address it, she remained in place, allowing the blood to drip freely for several seconds before responding to my alarmed exclamation. I could have sworn I heard a faint sizzling sound as drops struck the shelf beneath the artifacts. My own accident in the home office left a paper cut that seemed impossibly deep for such a minor injury. The blood soaked through several important documents, rendering them unusable. When Elena discovered this, she collected the papers with that same unsettling calmness, assuring me she would dispose of them appropriately. I never saw those papers again. Our careers began to suffer. My investment recommendations resulted in substantial losses for key clients. Elena received notification that her research grant application had been rejected due to methodological concerns regarding her acquisition practices. Our savings dwindled as unexpected expenses mounted. A basement flood, a roof leak directly above the vessel display, though peculiarly, the vessels remained untouched by water damage. Automobile repairs following an inexplicable engine failure. Sleep became increasingly elusive. The dreams intensified, now featuring Elena in elaborate pre-Incan regalia, presiding over ceremonies I couldn't, or wouldn't, fully recall upon waking. More disturbing were the moments I'd wake to find her side of the bed empty, only to discover her standing motionless before the vessels, whispering in a language I couldn't identify. When confronted the next morning, she had no recollection of these nocturnal activities. During one such episode, I noticed fresh bandages on her index finger. When questioned, She claimed to have cut herself fixing a frame in her study. The frame in question, when I checked later, contained a meticulously rendered drawing of the three vessels, surrounded by symbols that matched those in my dreams. The glass had indeed been recently replaced. It was spotlessly clean except for a small, rust-colored fingerprint in one corner. Our social connections withered. Friends stopped calling after Elena behaved erratically at a dinner party, spending the entire evening discussing blood rituals in pre-Columbian cultures, while repeatedly checking her watch as sunset approached. My colleagues maintained strictly professional interactions after I experienced a panic attack during a board meeting, suddenly convinced that everyone present was wearing elaborate animal masks beneath their human faces. 4 months into our Canadian residence, I contacted Dr. Alejandro Vega, a Peruvian anthropologist who specialized in the region where our vessels originated. Our video consultation began professionally enough, with me showing him photographs of the artifacts. His expression remained neutral until I rotated the largest vessel to display its base, at which point his scholarly composure fractured. He explained, reluctantly at first, that the markings identified these as ritual objects from a small, isolated culture that practiced particularly aggressive forms of sacrifice. Unlike their contemporaries who performed such rituals seasonally, this group believed their deities required continuous offerings. The vessels, which he called Colca de Wanyui, or reservoirs of death, were designed to collect and preserve sacrificial blood, maintaining a continuous connection between the mortal and divine realms. When I pressed him about our experiences, his academic detachment faltered further. He asked whether we had noticed an escalation of accidents, particularly those resulting in bloodshed. His expression at my affirmative response conveyed nothing so simple as fear, rather, a resigned recognition. He explained that the vessels, removed from their ceremonial context and ancestral lands, would seek to replicate their original purpose. They required periodic feeding, blood offerings, and an eventual return to their place of origin. The longer they remained abroad, the more aggressively they would pursue fulfillment of these requirements. I scoffed at these assertions despite the cold dread settling in my chest. When I asked why anyone would create such objects, his response haunted me. They were never meant to leave their temple complex. They had been designed specifically to prevent theft through supernatural deterrence, the ultimate security system for a culture that valued blood as the supreme currency between worlds. Before ending our conversation, Dr. Vega issued a clear warning. Return the vessels to Peru immediately, specifically to a temple foundation near their excavation site, accompanied by an offering. The nature of this offering remained deliberately vague in his explanation, though the implication was clear enough. When I asked about alternatives, his response was simple and chilling. We had already begun paying in blood. The vessels would merely increase their collection efforts until satisfied. I ended the call convinced the man was either perpetuating superstitious nonsense or attempting to acquire valuable artifacts through intimidation. Yet that night, I dreamed more vividly than ever of standing before a stone altar, knife in hand, Elena beside me wearing elaborate ceremonial attire, the three vessels positioned to catch what would flow from my outstretched arm. I woke to find myself standing in the living room, a kitchen knife in my grip, positioned directly before the vessel display. Elena stood opposite me, her expression vacantly serene, a similar knife in her own hand. The vessels between us seemed to pulse with a dull, earthen glow. Neither of us spoke as awareness gradually returned. The knives clattered to the floor simultaneously. That morning, without discussion, I booked 2 tickets to Lima. Elena, emerging from whatever fugue had claimed her these past months, helped me carefully rewrap the vessels in their original cloths. As we worked, I noticed fresh scars on her forearms, thin, precise lines that couldn't have resulted from household accidents. She caught my gaze and wordlessly pushed up my own sleeve, revealing similar marks I had no memory of acquiring. In the following days, as we prepared for departure, the household atmosphere shifted palpably. The cold spots dissipated. The power remained stable. Sleep, when it came, was dreamless and deep. Yet occasionally I would catch Elena staring longingly at the wrapped packages, her fingers tracing absent patterns on her arms. Once I found her in the kitchen, a knife balanced across her palm, her expression disturbingly contemplative until I spoke her name. The return journey to Peru feels like an extension of our shared trance. We move through airports and taxis with mechanical efficiency, the wrapped vessels secured in a specialized carrier. Elena has arranged for a local guide, not Miguel, whose number no longer connects, to meet us at a specific location outside Cusco. She assures me the guide understands our purpose without elaboration. Tomorrow, we will make the final journey to return these artifacts to their original location. Elena has packed additional supplies she refuses to detail. I've seen the bandages and collection vials in her kit but choose not to question them. Part of me knows, has perhaps always known, what the vessel's final feeding will require. I tell myself we're simply returning stolen artifacts to their rightful place, participating in cultural repatriation rather than anything more primitive or supernatural. Yet as I write this in our Lima hotel room, watching Elena sleep peacefully for the first time in months, I cannot deny the pulse I feel emanating from the wrapped packages across the room. They seem to beat in rhythm with my heart, a synchronization that feels both invasive and strangely intimate. The vessels know they're going home. They know we understand our role as both couriers and final tribute bearers. I should feel relief that our ordeal approaches its conclusion. Instead, I'm disturbed by the hollow sensation expanding within me. Not fear exactly, but a resignation that borders on anticipation. Part of me has begun to understand the ancient impulse that created these vessels, the belief that some connections can only be forged through blood. More disturbing still is the realization taking shape as I watch the vessel's subtle pulsation. I'm not entirely certain we'll actually return them. Elena stirs in her sleep, her fingers tracing geometric patterns against the sheets. The same patterns etched into the vessel's surfaces. The same patterns now faintly visible beneath the skin of my forearms when I stand in certain light. Perhaps we'll board our return flight to Canada empty-handed, telling ourselves we've done the right thing. Perhaps the vessels will remain in their rightful place among the ruins, or perhaps they've already found their new home. Story 7. The corner of our living room doesn't belong to this world. I've known it since the day my wife and I moved into her family home, a colonial monstrosity with too many rooms and too few windows. Something about the way shadows collect there, defying the natural flow of light. My brother and sister visit often, claiming the familiarity of their childhood home draws them back. But I've seen how they both stare at that corner, heads tilted in unison, responding to questions no one has asked. They call him Vovo, grandfather in Portuguese, a language neither of them speaks. Their grandfather has been missing for 30 years. Not dead, the family insists, just missing. I first noticed it 3 weeks ago when the autumn chill crept into Massachusetts. My sister Emma sat cross-legged before that damned corner, nodding and smiling at empty space. João, my brother, stood nearby, hands in pockets, contributing occasional words to this one-sided exchange. When I asked who they were talking to, Emma simply pointed to the corner and said, "Vovo is telling us about Portugal." João smiled apologetically, explaining that they'd always been able to see him there, even as adults. The casual way they dismissed my confusion sent ice through my veins. That night, I watched my wife Maria sleep, her breathing even despite the occasional twitch of her eyelids. The moonlight cast bars across our bed, and I wondered what images played behind her closed eyes. She'd mentioned dreaming of corridors lately, endless hallways lined with stone, a voice calling her forward. The next morning, her face appeared gaunt, exhausted. She described walking through an infinite mausoleum-like corridor, where she'd encountered her father, the same grandfather my siblings conversed with in our living room corner. According to Maria, he had messages for us all. The house began changing after that. Nothing drastic at first. A light that refused to stay on. The persistent smell of tobacco, though no one smoked. Doors that swung open after being firmly closed. I attempted to capture the corner on camera, setting up equipment when everyone had gone to bed. The footage showed nothing but static and electronic distortion whenever I pointed the lens at that specific area. When I suggested to Maria that we have the electrical wiring checked, she looked at me with unfamiliar eyes, and suggested I was being unnecessarily anxious. My research into the family history revealed precious little. Maria's grandfather, Antonio Santos, had emigrated from Portugal in the 1950s, built this house with his own hands, and then vanished 3 decades ago during a routine trip to Boston. No body was ever found, no trace of foul play. The family steadfastly refused to declare him dead. His room remained untouched on the 3rd floor, preserved like a museum exhibit. The first time I entered that room, my lungs constricted as though the air had suddenly thickened. Photographs covered every surface. Antonio as a young man in Portugal, at his wedding, holding his children, building this very house. My attention fixed on one particular image. Antonio standing in our living room, precisely in front of that corner, his expression unreadable. Behind him, barely visible in the faded photograph, stood a dark figure, its features indistinct but unmistakably present. I began experiencing episodes of missing time. I'd be working in my home office, then suddenly find myself standing before that corner with no recollection of how I'd gotten there. My skin would be cold to the touch, my heart hammering against my ribs as though I'd been running. Sometimes I'd find notes in my own handwriting, scrawled in Portuguese, a language I'd never studied. The dream started a week later. I found myself walking through stone corridors that extended endlessly in all directions. The walls were lined with small alcoves, each containing photographs and personal items I recognized from Antonio's room. The air hung heavy with the scent of tobacco and sea salt. A voice echoed throughout this labyrinth, speaking in Portuguese, the words incomprehensible, yet somehow familiar. I would wake gasping for air, my pajamas soaked with sweat, the taste of salt on my lips. I began avoiding the living room altogether, making excuses to work late or run errands when my siblings visited. Maria noticed my avoidance, confronting me with accusations of distancing myself from her family. I couldn't explain that every time I entered that room, I felt watched by something ancient and patient. How could I describe the pressure that built behind my eyes whenever I approached that corner, or the whispers I'd begun to hear when alone in the house? Yesterday, I broke. João and Emma had been sitting in the living room for hours, engaged in their one-sided conversation with empty space. I stormed in, demanding to know what game they were playing. The look of genuine confusion on their faces sent chills racing down my spine. Emma asked if I was feeling well, stating that Vovo had been concerned about my health lately. João mentioned that Vovo had been telling them about a hidden space beneath the house, one that connected to a network of tunnels. Tunnels that supposedly led to the same corridors Maria had been dreaming about. My hands trembled as I examined the foundation plans I'd retrieved from the town records office. The original blueprints showed nothing unusual, but a revision filed 3 years after construction indicated an addition, a small cellar beneath the northeast corner of the house, the living room corner. The clerk couldn't explain why this revision had been filed separately from the main plans, or why it had been marked with a strange symbol rather than the official town seal. That night, after Maria had fallen asleep, I took a crowbar to the floorboards in that corner. The wood came away with surprising ease, as though it had been recently disturbed. Beneath, instead of the expected floor joists and insulation, I found a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from this opening carried the unmistakable scent of tobacco and sea salt, the same smell from my dreams. My flashlight revealed stairs carved directly into the earth, spiraling down farther than its beam could reach. The walls were lined with the same alcoves from my dreams, each containing photographs, letters, and small personal effects. I recognized Maria's childhood toys, João's high school soccer medals, Emma's first pair of glasses. My fingers brushed against one alcove and came away wet, not with groundwater, but with salt water that stung the paper cuts on my hands. As I descended, the staircase gradually transformed, the earthen walls giving way to worked stone, the roughly carved steps becoming smooth marble. The temperature dropped steadily until I could see my breath clouding before me. The flashlight beam weakened, though I'd put in fresh batteries before starting my exploration. The darkness seemed to consume the light, rather than be illuminated by it. At what felt like hundreds of feet below the house, The staircase opened into a corridor identical to the one from my dreams. The hallway extended in both directions, curving gently so that I couldn't see more than 100 feet in either direction. The walls were lined with more alcoves, these containing items I'd never seen before. Faded photographs of people who resembled Maria but weren't her. Letters in Portuguese bearing dates from centuries past. Small carved figurines that seemed to shift position when viewed from the corner of my eye. My heart pounded against my ribs, each beat echoing in the confined space. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cold, running down my face and neck in icy rivulets. My mouth went desert dry as I forced myself forward, choosing a direction at random. The flashlight flickered, plunging me into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. In those brief seconds of blackness, I heard footsteps behind me, unhurried and deliberate. I spun around, the beam of light slicing through empty corridor. But the footsteps continued, now ahead of me, now behind, now from side passages I hadn't noticed before. My own breathing sounded thunderous in this underground space, coming in short, panicked gasps that did little to satisfy my oxygen-starved lungs. My muscles tensed, preparing for flight, though I had no idea which direction offered escape. The corridor began to shift subtly as I moved forward. The ceiling lowered incrementally, forcing me to stoop. The walls seemed to press inward, narrowing my path. The alcoves grew more frequent and more personal, containing items from my own life, my college diploma, the tie I wore at my wedding, the manuscript of my unfinished novel, which I kept locked in my desk drawer, a photograph of myself as a child, standing in front of a house I'd never seen, with people I didn't recognize. A voice called out from somewhere ahead, speaking Portuguese in the same cadence as the whispers I'd been hearing in the house. The words remained incomprehensible, but their meaning seemed to press against my mind, seeking entrance. My ears popped as though I'd descended much deeper than physically possible. The taste of salt grew stronger in my mouth. Around a bend in the corridor, a figure stood with its back to me. The shape was unmistakably human, dressed in clothes from another era, a heavy wool coat, high-waisted trousers, a flat cap clutched in one hand. Even without seeing the face, I knew this was Antonio. His shoulders rose and fell with breath, dispelling any notion that I was seeing a ghost or hallucination. My legs locked in place as terror flooded my system. Antonio began to turn, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who has all the time in the world. I caught a glimpse of his profile, the same strong nose and jawline that Maria had inherited, before my survival instinct finally kicked in. I turned and ran, no longer caring about the direction, simply needing to be away from that figure who couldn't possibly exist in this underground labyrinth. The corridor twisted and branched, offering choices I made blindly, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly across stone walls. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I continued running until I collided with a dead end. The stone wall before me was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, overlapping, showing the house from various eras. In each image, no matter the decade, the same dark figure stood in the corner of the living room, sometimes in the foreground, sometimes barely visible in the background, but always present, always watching. Among these was a photograph I recognized, my wedding day. Maria and I stood before the house, surrounded by her family, and there in the window, visible but overlooked until now, was the distinctive silhouette of an elderly man watching the proceedings. The flashlight died completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. The air became thick, almost solid in my lungs. Footsteps approached from behind, unhurried and confident. A hand, cold and dry as parchment, came to rest on my shoulder. A voice spoke directly into my ear in accented English. "You are part of this family now. You are part of this house. The corridors connect us all." I didn't remember climbing back up the staircase or replacing the floorboards. I awoke this morning in bed beside Maria, my clothes filthy with a mixture of earth and what laboratory tests would later confirm as sea salt from the Atlantic coast of Portugal. Under my fingernails were stone fragments that geologists would identify as not belonging to any formation in North America. Maria smiles at me differently now. She says I finally understand her family. My siblings visit more often, all three of them sitting before that corner, acknowledging the presence I can now see, the silhouette of an elderly man that becomes more solid each day. They tell me that Vovo is pleased that I found the corridors, that I'm truly part of the family now. I've begun dreaming of the corridors myself. Each night they become more familiar, less frightening. Sometimes I wake to find myself standing in that corner, engaged in conversation with Antonio in broken Portuguese that improves with each passing night. He tells me about the house, about the corridors that connect it to Portugal, to the past, to other places entirely. Maria doesn't know that I've discovered her grandfather's journal hidden in a compartment beneath his bed. The entries date back to the 1950s, detailing his discovery of the corridors beneath the original foundation, how he learned to navigate them, how he found they could take him anywhere, across oceans, across time. The final entry, dated the day of his disappearance, describes his plan to remain in the corridors permanently, to become their guardian and keeper. I've started taking Portuguese lessons. I tell Maria it's to better connect with her heritage. The truth is both simpler and more terrifying. I need to understand what Antonio is telling me about my role in all this, about what the house expects from me, about why he chose our family to guard the corner that doesn't belong to this world. The corner watches me now, waits for me, and sometimes when the house is quiet and the shadows gather just right, I find myself walking toward it, drawn by the promise of corridors that lead everywhere and nowhere at once. Story 8. And the first time I noticed the porcelain ballerina had moved, I dismissed it as forgetfulness. The second time, I blamed the uneven floorboards of my grandmother's Victorian home in Alton. By the third time, when I found it staring at me from the foot of my bed at 3 a.m., its delicate painted face catching moonlight through the curtains, I could no longer deny something was terribly wrong in this house. My inheritance of grandmother Eleanor's estate came with strings attached, specifically that I would live in her home for at least 1 year before deciding its fate. The insurance money from my apartment fire left me with few options, so I accepted the terms and moved into the creaking, drafty mansion on State Street that had intimidated me throughout my childhood. I'd always found excuses to avoid overnight visits, something about the house setting my nerves on edge even as a teenager. Now, at 36, I was trapped here by circumstance and legal obligation. The porcelain ballerina had been grandmother's prized possession, a handcrafted antique she'd received on her 16th birthday. She'd shown it to me dozens of times during my visits, always handling it with white cotton gloves, explaining how rare and valuable it was. I'd never understood her attachment to the thing. Its frozen pirouette and blank blue eyes had always seemed unsettling rather than beautiful. When I unpacked it after moving in, I placed it in the glass cabinet in the parlor, hoping to keep it safe but out of sight. The night winds howled through the eaves as I carried the ballerina back to the cabinet for the 4th time that week. My fingers trembled as I placed it on the shelf, careful not to damage its delicate tutu or outstretched arms. Despite the central heating system I'd installed, my breath clouded in front of me. The nearby thermometer read 42 degrees, though the rest of the house maintained a comfortable 72. This cold spot had appeared the day after I moved in, centered perfectly around the cabinet that housed grandmother's collection. I closed the cabinet door, hearing the latch click into place. My pulse hammered in my throat as I tested the door. Locked, as it should be. I was the only person with a key to that cabinet. The rational part of my brain insisted there must be a logical explanation for the ballerina's movements, but that voice was growing fainter with each passing day. My friend Marcus had suggested setting up cameras after hearing about my haunted ballerina, as he mockingly called it. He'd dropped off a set of motion-activated security cameras the previous weekend, barely concealing his amusement at what he clearly considered to be my overactive imagination. According to Marcus, old houses settled and played tricks on the mind. He suggested I was sleepwalking, or perhaps experiencing some delayed trauma response to my apartment fire. I wished I could believe him. The cameras had captured nothing unusual for 3 nights. The porcelain ballerina stayed in place, the house remained quiet, and I began to think perhaps I was indeed losing my grip on reality. Then, on the fourth night, every camera in the house failed simultaneously at 2:17 a.m. When they came back online at 4:03 a.m., the ballerina was perched on the kitchen counter, facing my bedroom door. The footage showed no evidence of tampering or entry. No shadows, no movement, no explanation. Just 106 minutes of darkness and a relocated porcelain figurine. My hands shook as I poured myself a double whiskey, the amber liquid sloshing over the rim of the glass. The rational explanations were dwindling, yet I couldn't bring myself to accept the alternative, that something supernatural was happening in my grandmother's house. The pressure in my chest tightened, my heart racing as cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I drained the glass, hoping the alcohol would calm my frayed nerves or at least help me sleep. As October deepened into November, my sleep deteriorated further. I'd jolt awake at odd hours, certain I'd heard footsteps on the stairs, or a woman humming an unfamiliar melody. Shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to shift and elongate when viewed from my peripheral vision. The cold spot around the cabinet expanded, engulfing the entire parlor, then spreading to adjacent rooms. I began researching the history of the house, spending hours at the Alton Public Library poring over property records and newspaper archives. The house had been built in 1873 by a river merchant named Hobson, who'd made his fortune in the steamboat era. After his financial ruin in the 1890s, the house changed hands several times before my grandmother purchased it in 1962. Nothing in its documented history suggested tragedy or circumstances that might explain a haunting. The librarian, a gray-haired woman with wire-rimmed glasses, watched me with growing concern as I returned day after day, my appearance becoming increasingly disheveled, dark circles forming under my eyes. After a week of this, she approached my table with a slip of paper. She murmured that if I was experiencing disturbances in an Alton home, I might want to speak with Dr. Mercer at the Historical Society. The way she emphasized disturbances made my skin crawl. She wouldn't meet my eyes as she turned and walked away. Dr. Mercer was a small, energetic man with a meticulously trimmed white beard. When I mentioned my grandmother's address, his enthusiastic expression faltered momentarily. He confirmed what the property records had shown. The house had an unremarkable history. No murders, no unexplained disappearances, nothing that would generate the kind of energy that paranormal enthusiasts associated with hauntings. But something in his hesitation made me press further. After some reluctance, Dr. Mercer admitted that while the house itself had no dark history, the land it stood on had been part of a property that once belonged to the Zimmerman family in the early 1800s. My pulse quickened at the name, blood rushing in my ears. The Zimmermans had been prominent citizens, he explained, until a scandal involving the eldest daughter led to their departure from Alton society. The family had moved west, leaving no descendants in the area. When I asked the daughter's name, Dr. Mercer consulted his notes and confirmed what I already feared. Candace Candy Zimmerman. My hands grew numb as pins and needles spread through my fingers. The room seemed to tilt slightly, Dr. Mercer's voice becoming distant and muffled. I hadn't told him about the Ouija board. I hadn't told anyone. It had been a foolish decision, born of desperation after 6 weeks of escalating phenomena. I'd purchased the board from a New Age shop in downtown Alton, the proprietor warning me with practiced solemnity about opening doors that couldn't be easily closed. I'd nodded impatiently, dismissing her concerns as superstitious nonsense, meant to add mystique to an overpriced piece of cardboard. That night, I'd set up the board on the dining room table, positioning my cameras to record the session. The house had seemed unusually quiet as I placed my fingers on the planchette, the heating system falling silent despite the thermostat being set to 78 degrees. My breath fogged in front of me as I asked if anyone was present. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. I felt simultaneously relieved and disappointed, until the planchette began to move with such sudden violence that my fingers could barely maintain contact. It spelled out a name, CandyZimmerman. When I'd asked who Candy was, the planchette had dragged my fingers to betrayed and then witness, before flying off the board entirely and clattering against the far wall. The cameras recorded the entire incident, including the planchette's impossible trajectory that defied physics. I'd deleted the footage the next morning in a moment of panic, suddenly afraid of what might happen if others saw it. Leaving the historical society, my mind raced with questions. What did a long-dead woman from the 1800s have to do with my grandmother's porcelain ballerina? What betrayal had occurred, and what had Candy witnessed? The answers began materializing that night. I woke to the sound of breaking glass at 2:17 a.m., the same time the cameras had failed weeks earlier. My body felt leaden, paralyzed with a terror that went beyond normal fear. The temperature in my bedroom had plummeted, my breath forming dense clouds above my face. Through the open doorway, I could see the hallway where moonlight illuminated the porcelain ballerina positioned outside my room. Beside it lay the shattered remains of a small hand mirror I recognized from my grandmother's vanity. In the fragments, I caught glimpses of reflection that didn't match the room around me. Flashes of a different time, women in long dresses, a garden that no longer existed behind the house. My muscles finally responded to my brain's commands, and I stumbled from the bed, heart hammering painfully against my ribs. I approached the ballerina cautiously, noticing a detail I'd somehow missed before. Painted onto the porcelain face was a tiny beauty mark near the right corner of the mouth, nearly invisible unless viewed in direct light. The realization hit me with such force that I staggered backward, colliding with the wall behind me. I'd seen that same distinctive beauty mark in one of the old photographs in Dr. Mercer's office, on the face of Candace Zimmerman. I spent the remainder of the night huddled in my car in the driveway, too terrified to remain in the house but too exhausted to drive anywhere. When dawn broke, I forced myself to return inside, drawn to the cabinet where grandmother had kept her collection. With trembling hands, I retrieved the key from my pocket and unlocked it. The ballerina had returned to its shelf, though I hadn't moved it. More troubling, I now noticed the base of the figurine, which I'd always assumed was a solid piece of porcelain. Closer inspection revealed a barely perceptible seam. Using my pocket knife, I carefully pried at the edge until the base separated from the figurine. Hidden inside was a folded scrap of yellowed paper. The handwriting faded but still legible. A confession, signed by my grandmother, detailing how she'd discovered evidence of Candy Zimmerman's murder while renovating the house in the 1960s. A crime committed by one of Alton's most respected historical figures. Rather than report it, she'd hidden the evidence to protect the town's reputation and her social standing. The beauty mark on the ballerina had been her private acknowledgement of her silence, her secret penance. The note ended with words that sent ice through my veins. She follows me now. She watches. The witness has become my witness. Understanding flooded through me. The ballerina wasn't haunted. It was a vessel. A connection to a woman whose story had been erased, whose justice had been denied. My grandmother's guilt had given Candy power, and now that connection had transferred to me. I knew what needed to be done. That afternoon, I contacted Dr. Mercer and local authorities, turning over the confession and explaining what I'd found. The scandal rocked Alton, forcing a re-examination of its celebrated history. Excavation began in the area that had once been the Zimmerman garden, now covered by my driveway. I expected the phenomena to cease after the truth was revealed, but in this I was mistaken. The ballerina still moves, though less frequently and with less malevolence. Sometimes I find it facing photographs of my grandmother, other times looking out windows toward the garden where Candy's remains were finally recovered and properly buried. I've chosen to remain in the house beyond my obligated year. There's a strange comfort in our arrangement now, me, the house, and the porcelain witness who ensures I never forget the cost of silence. On quiet nights, I sometimes hear a woman humming from the parlor, the melody no longer unfamiliar. The chill never quite leaves certain rooms, and sometimes the mirrors show reflections that don't belong to this century. But we've reached an understanding, Candy and I. Truth was all she wanted, someone to acknowledge what had happened to her, to speak her name again in the town that had chosen to forget her. I keep the ballerina on my nightstand now, its blue eyes watching as I drift to sleep. Some might find this arrangement terrifying. Perhaps it is. But there are worse fates than sharing your home with a ghost who only wanted to be remembered. Far worse is the knowledge that my grandmother went to her grave carrying the weight of her silence, haunted by the witness she refused to become. Story 9. The first time my sister mentioned seeing her, I dismissed it as nothing more than the imagination of a woman exhausted from caring for our dying grandmother. The second time, I suggested she get more sleep. By the third time, she'd already moved out of the house, refusing to spend another night under that roof. 6 months later, I inherited the property. 6 months and 1 day later, I saw the girl with blue bows myself. The Victorian house had stood on Blackwood Lane for over a century, weathering storms both meteorological and familial. Its aging wooden bones creaked with each gust of wind, as if sighing under the weight of accumulated memories. When I moved in after my grandmother's passing, I told myself it was practical. Free housing while I sorted out my life after a bitter divorce. The truth, which I barely admitted even to myself, was that I needed to understand what had driven my sister away. Rebecca had always been the rational one between us. As children, she was the one who checked the closets and under the beds when I was convinced monsters lurked in the darkness. She became a research scientist, devoted to empirical evidence and logical conclusions. So when she called me at 3 a.m, her voice trembling as she described seeing a young girl with blue hair bows sitting in our grandmother's favorite chair, I knew something was wrong. "She just sat there, Michael," she had whispered, her voice barely audible over the static of the phone line. "She wasn't doing anything, just sitting, watching me." Then she smiled. The second sighting occurred a week later. Rebecca had fallen asleep on the couch while reading research papers. She woke suddenly, the sensation of being watched pulling her from sleep. The girl was lying on the opposite end of the sofa, her small feet nearly touching Rebecca's legs, those blue bows vivid against her pale hair. Rebecca moved out the next day, staying with me until she found her own place 50 miles away. I unpacked my belongings slowly during that first week in the house, each box a commitment to staying despite my sister's warnings. The master bedroom remained untouched. I couldn't bring myself to claim what had been my grandmother's space. Instead, I took the room that had once been Rebecca's, its walls still bearing the faded outlines of posters she had hung as a teenager. The house felt larger than I remembered, the hallways stretching longer in the evening shadows. I attributed the goosebumps on my arms to poor insulation, the whispers at the edge of hearing to pipes and settling foundations. The scientific explanations became my mantra as I moved through the empty rooms. I established a routine quickly, hoping structure would combat the unease that crept along my spine whenever I entered certain areas of the house. My grandmother's sitting room remained closed, her favorite chair draped with a sheet like a surrendered ghost. I told myself it was out of respect, not fear. The first incident occurred 11 days after I moved in. I'd been in the kitchen preparing dinner, the radio playing softly to combat the silence. The music cut out abruptly, replaced by static that grew progressively louder. My skin prickled as the temperature in the room plummeted, my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. Then came the laughter, high and childlike, yet somehow wrong, as if played at the wrong speed. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly turned toward the doorway. Nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. I convinced myself it was a power surge affecting the radio, ignoring how the laughter had seemed to come from all around me rather than the speakers. 3 days later, I was working at my laptop in the living room when the scent of lilacs filled the air. My grandmother had always worn lilac perfume, its sweet fragrance announcing her presence before she entered a room. I inhaled deeply, memories washing over me. When I opened my eyes, they fell on a small indentation in the sofa cushion beside me, as if someone weightless